We need people here. Skilled workers, healthcare workers. Your home, your family's home, can be here, safe, in Canada.
I have seen almost exclusively misinformation, specifically relating to seeking asylum in Canada, that I believe is putting my community at risk. To be clear, I know that we all acknowledge that things are not safe right now for trans people, especially socially speaking, right? That if your application is denied, you will not be allowed to apply again or enter the country. The people that are telling you, yeah, go ahead and apply because you'll definitely be accepted, they are wrong.
Folks, when I was young, I believed that as bad as things were in the US, perhaps one day I should move to Canada and be among people who are a little bit more friendly, kind, progressive. They had medical care, social services, things that we in the US could not expect to have. But with time, I've kind of realized that a lot of Canadians are full of it. They're really full of it. They don't want to address in seriousness the inequality, the instability, and the fundamental imperialism at the heart of their country. Worry no more about this issue because today we're going to tackle it. And I want to start here. I want to start with this TikTok that I found. This guy who's like a content creator. He's been around for a while. He's been on part of CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He's made this viral TikTok to which a ton of Americans are flocking. It's basically just him being like, come to Canada.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd. We've been watching the news. We know it's getting worse down there, and we want to help. We need people here. Skilled workers, healthcare workers. Our government's targets are 400,000 new permanent residents this year alone. Your home, your family's home, can be here, safe, in Canada. And in this video, I'm going to tell you how. But first, let us talk about your uncle who spends too much time on Facebook. You may have heard from him that our healthcare system is broken, or you spend years on a waiting list waiting for urgent care. The truth is, if you have an ingrown toenail, you might be further down the list.
We're going to get into it, but there's a tone you're going to notice in this video that perhaps in a sincere attempt to actually offer a maple leaf to Americans who are looking to move away from their discontent of the US, there's a tone that's just like a little condescending, especially condescending to people who are actually suffering from these real issues. Like, if you think that the only people who are getting waitlisted for a long time in Canada for their public healthcare system are people with ingrown toenails, then you're completely disconnected, completely detached.
We call this system triage. It's the same system your healthcare system uses too, except here nobody loses their home or their savings because they got sick. Is it slower than we want it to be? Sometimes. But we don't build things here for speed or profit. We build them for everyone.
Wow! So it turns out that Canada has invented communism. I didn't realize this, but Canada is actually super communist because they don't do things for profit. Can you believe it? They're not a capitalist country. They don't do things for speed or profit. I mean, where do you start? First and foremost, Canadian economic discourse has often centered on the lack of labor productivity, the diminishing labor productivity over time. Now, if you follow this kind of economic conversation, you know that this is the case across OECD countries. And what has Canada done to address its lack of labor productivity? Well, it's giving incentives for entrepreneurs, fiscal incentives for productivity-enhancing assets. Okay, maybe things that speed up the process of labor. Regulatory sandboxes to reduce bureaucratic red tape. Enhanced federal research support. Oh, research into what? And a $200 million investment in the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative. Okay, so Canada is leaning harder into venture capitalism to try to remedy its lack of labor productivity. Not to get into it super much, but the idea of what labor productivity is essentially that for every hour, and this is a piece from Ako Ufodike on The Conversation. He writes that between 2015 and 2023, Canadian productivity fell by an average of 0.8% per year. This means that for every hour worked by Canadian employees, their output decreased by about 8% over that entire period. It's essentially the idea that there's not as many jobs through which the average worker is contributing as much profit. And that can come down to a lot of different factors. But Canada is certainly leaning into the classic right-wing capitalist ideas in order to solve it. That's how you end up with Mark Carney as your premier, okay, as your prime minister. Thanks, Limbs and Games. Canada is not okay, guys, and we are not better than the States. I actually don't know what PR acceptance is, Divine, but if you could explain that a little bit more, I'd love to share that. The Fine Boy says he's right, though. The waitlist talking point is made by people who want to abolish healthcare in Canada entirely. So while I disagree, obviously, with people who want to abolish healthcare in Canada entirely, and I agree with Todd that your uncle on Facebook, meaning your average right-wing commentator who shits on public healthcare, is being disingenuous and downplaying the successes of the Canadian healthcare system. The Canadian healthcare system still has a lot of failures, and a lot of those failures come from having more in common with your uncle on Facebook than you realize. Meaning cuts. Actually, I was just about to talk about this. Austerity measures. Okay, this was a few days ago. Canada's Mark Carney signals austerity measures as government shifts focus from Trump to economy. They're going to spend near record defense spending, and they're going to cut from government programs. And this is not the first time Canada has cut from government programs in the past 20 years. Let's say that. But Carney's saying government spending's too high, and it's outpacing the growth of Canada's economy. And of course, the growth of the economy, meaning the amount of money that rich people make relative to the year before, that's obviously the most important thing, not the standard of living for average people. So austerity, the same kind of policy economically that is shaping the Trump administration is also being shaped by Mark Carney. Well, at least Mark Carney hasn't been trying to work with the right-wing conservatives that Donald Trump was platformed by, that back him and all of his nasty civil rights policies. And what's this? Eyebrows were raised when Carney invited Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank with close ties to the White House, to address the ministerial meeting. The Heritage Foundation was a key architect of Project 2025, for those who don't know, a proposal that envisioned an ultra-conservative reshaping of the U.S. federal government. So clearly Carney is more friendly to this right wing, especially on economic terms, which, let's face it, are the main terms of the battle when it comes to the war on poor people and all the different marginalized people that belong to the lesser classes of the United States, the lesser classes of the world. Mark Carney's a lot more friendly with that war than he might appear to be as he talks a big game about Trump. Okay? But Canada doesn't care about profit. Canada doesn't care about speed. What else does Canada not care about?
You may have also heard that we'll take anyone, including the queers. Guilty. Doesn't matter to us who you love. Just be decent. When the girl guides come around, buy their cookies. You don't have to eat them. We don't. Guns? Your uncle's wrong there too.
We'll talk about the queer thing in a second, but yeah, you can expect in a lot of cities in Canada, not a lot of cities, but especially the main cities of Canada, Toronto, etc., that there will be a queer friendly atmosphere, the likes of which you might see in, certain cities of the US.
You can own one up here if you're into hunting or whatever, but you'll need a written exam, practical tests, background checks, a review of your mental health history, any domestic violence in your past, and your license expires every 5 years. Gun ownership here is a privilege. It's not a right.
So what's interesting about this is that this is fairly true. So if you're in Canada and you want to get a handgun, but you do have, domestic violence on your record or other such personality flaws, just become a police officer. This is an article from the CBC. Again, Julie Ireton, detailing how 1 in 3 suspensions across Ontario involved allegations of domestic abuse and sexual assault in the police force of Ontario. So 36% of officers accused of crimes involving gender-based violence were convicted. By contrast, the rate of criminal conviction was 41% for other charges, including drug trafficking, fraud, impaired driving, and assault. But the chief of police says, we hire from the human race, and these are events that occur in the officers' private life. Oh no! That sure sounds like you're not super worried about the character of the people that you're hiring in certain cases. So there's obviously some examples that are cited in this case, including a key feature with an interview. But what's really troubling here, as you can see in the headline, among the 158 suspensions tied to allegations of gender-based violence since 2013, CBC found close to 1/3 of the 53 criminally convicted officers returned to work after fulfilling their disciplinary requirements, such as a conditional discharge. There's no rule against an officer getting back on the job after being convicted of a crime unless they've been sentenced to imprisonment. And so that issue that people talk about when it comes to the American police force, similar thing happening in Canada. That's just something I want to point out. I know nobody cares about violence when it comes from the state, when it's enshrined by the state, when it's done by police, but it does count as violence too, I think. I'm just reading a couple comments right now. Not gonna lie, I feel less alone with the feeling of country falling apart in South Korea right now, and the country has always been struggling with stuff. Yeah, it's a global struggle. This is not something that you're going to escape in a different country, okay? These crises like austerity, you're not going to escape, and the, let's say, corruption of police forces, you're not going to escape when you leave the United States. Divine, I'm going to check your PR explanation here. PR is permanent residency. I moved here, says Divine, to get my master's last summer, and right after they heavily restricted student visas / PR, they're tilting heavy anti-immigrant sentiment, right? And so Divine also says, Canada has just cut new acceptance of permanent residency. My boss has to drive 3 hours to get his kids to a family PCP doctor. Ashley Robb, Canadian tuning in. It also sucks here. Okay, well, Todd says that, we're not a perfect country in Canada, Ashley, but, well, we're better than the US, right?
Handguns, military assault rifles aren't sold here anymore. In the US, there have been 300 mass shootings this year. In Canada, there have been 2. Still terrible. Still painful, but 2. You may have also heard that Canada has higher income taxes than the US. That is also true, but the difference is 2%. Is 2% worth not having to buy bulletproof backpacks for your kids?
So
Going an ER visit won't bankrupt you?
The bulletproof backpack thing I just think is a little bit low. I don't like that people use gun violence in America, which homicides from gun violence have been declining over the past couple of years. Obviously, it is an issue. But to talk to people and to stoke these fears that are very real, to say, hey, well, you should come to Canada instead, to promote this agenda where you're looking for skilled workers, it just feels crass to me. It just feels low. And it feels like also a gross misunderstanding of what the situation is like for most Americans who don't experience gun violence, and because they live in certain enclaves where it's not to be expected, where certain states and cities where the restrictions are much higher. This is not to say that, again, the United States has no gun violence problem, even in the most restrictive cases, the most restrictive states. But it's very obvious to me that for folks like this, there is an agenda to suggest that America is just this wild west where you gotta duck and cover, you gotta run behind walls, you gotta be scared every day that somebody's gonna shoot you, right? Especially your kids. And I just don't think that that's very decent. Like, would you say to a person, if you really believed in this crisis to this significant of a level, would you say to a person in a third world country, as y'all like to say, a person in a rural part of Latin America, in a rough part of Mexico, hey, well, come to the US, you got to pay some income taxes, but it's either that or, hope that your kid doesn't get shot at school. So which is it going to be? Like, that's just not a classy thing to say. That's not a very dignified thing to say. And it gives a sense that you don't actually care as much about these issues as you think you do. That's a rhetorical problem on my part. That's a rhetorical quipe. Quipe? Gripe? What the fuck am I saying? That's a rhetorical gripe that I have. Does Elliot live in the US? Yes, I do. Morg says, I hope we're not going to view this problem as a black or white, Canada all good / all bad. I'd still pick Canada over the US in this climate. So I've talked about this issue before when it comes to Europe. You don't just pick countries like it's a video game where you can measure attributes. It's not UFC 5. You're not comparing the attributes of Kevin Holland with the attributes of fucking Jack Della Maddalena and being like, well, he's obviously a better fighter. This is real life where you actually have to consider the things you have to go through in order to immigrate to a place, and whether or not the place you're going to migrate to is a fit for you and what you need. And that is something that is going to be subjective for many different people, especially in cases where a person isn't getting some type of temporary residence to do a specific task. And I think while this isn't going to be a Canada Bash Fest video, I am not saying nobody move to Canada, and I want to make that clear, because sometimes people will read the title and suggest that that's what I'm saying. I also need for people to understand that Canada and the US are like this. They work like this together. Canada has a lot of the same problems that the US has. And you're not going to escape the main problems that you face in the United States by simply fleeing to Canada in most cases. In many of the cases in which you would escape those problems, you could also practically escape them by going to a different state in the US. In many cases, okay? There's a lot of different economic backgrounds to take into consideration, ethnic backgrounds to take into consideration, and of course, cases of sexuality, right? Disability. But for the most part, people have a very unrealistic picture in their heads of what it is like to migrate. They think it is, oh, I like this country. It has +5 in this and +2 in this. It's -1 in this, but I'll take that. No, you're not measuring attributes of characters in a video game. You're measuring where you are going to practically live. Morgan says, sorry, I am an immigrant. I have a choice between the two countries in a way, but I'd just be a lot more homeless in the US than up here. It's possible that you would be, right? And I'm not trying to say to leave Canada at all. As an immigrant, you have to make those choices for yourself. But a lot of those choices come down to, am I going to be able to have people around me that look like me, that can culturally help me assimilate? Am I going to be in a state that has legislation that is against me, or a province that is going to have legislation against me and my civil rights? Am I going to get the residency status? Am I going to get the citizenship status? You know what it's like. So that's why I don't like the Canada better than the US though argument. It's just not connected with what the actual people whose lives are actually, you know, potentially at risk here, or very much at risk here, what they're actually thinking, what they actually have to process. And in a way, it's almost dismissive, because for a lot of people, it's like saying, well, oh, you're not making cost of living work in the US. You're worried about getting kidnapped by ICE. You're worried about getting attacked for your sexuality or how you look. Well, you could just avoid it by going to Canada. And that's obviously not the right approach to talking to a person like that. Let's finish with this TikTok and then we'll move on.
Look, we're not perfect up here. We have our problems, but we are a young country still. We're still building here. We're building a place where your kids can be safe.
I wanted to mention really quickly when he says this young country thing, and then actually I'll just close it there because there's not much to say. Canada has existed since 1867. It is not, I mean, I guess compared to the US, it's a young country. Compared to a lot of other countries, it's a young country. Maybe. Countries are themselves, in terms of the modern parameters of what a country is, you know, they're not that old in the first place. Like, how old is the current government of Spain? Like, the country, Spain has existed for thousands of years, but how old has Spain existed in the current arrangement it currently exists in? It's younger than Canada, right? A lot of countries completely rebuilt. Like, how many governments did France cycle through post the French Revolution? These are the things you have to take into consideration when people say, oh, we're just such a young country. Okay, first of all, you weren't born yesterday. And second of all, whether or not you're a young country, do you have the addressing for the issues or not? Are you doing what other countries that are younger than you are doing? What makes a country young or not? All these are the questions that I have when I hear something like that. How many republics has France had? Exactly, Divine. How many republics has France had? So today, you know, we can talk a bit about the history of the Canadian genocide of Indigenous peoples. Maybe this is something I'd like to do for another day mostly, though. Basic points: forced displacement, land dispossession, deliberate starvation policies, physical violence and compulsory assimilation programs, atrocities, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. Canada is a settler colonial nation. We know this, right? And we know that there's a lot of genocide denialists still in Canada, but that Canada has, in the past 20 years, started to address certain of the inequities that still plague Indigenous communities to this day. But that doesn't mean those inequities don't exist. This is an interesting piece from Shadow magazine. It's an opinion piece by Rahul Balasundaram, where, you know, just to give you a couple of lines, he says, Canada is often depicted as a peace-loving and welcoming country on the world stage, partly due to its own efforts to distance itself from its noisy neighbors to the south. See Todd's TikTok, right? But while these liberal notions of diversity and multiculturalism offer a refreshing alternative to the global rise in far-right nationalism and fascism, the political mythology of Canadian exceptionalism masks the country's colonial past and present, especially during the climate crisis, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a sec. So what does he mean? So despite the pervasive narratives of openness to immigration, Canada has developed various policies to deter migration to its borders. It's one of the only countries to detain non-citizens indefinitely, okay? And Canada is also wrecking the environment, which is disproportionately affecting Indigenous folks in Canada. There's a reason why the folks that will do this Canadian exceptionalism shit are white folks. And that those white folks are often well-to-do white folks, because those are the folks that have benefited from the settler colonial project. Whereas the Indigenous folks from Canada, the people whose land got taken from them by force, are often still living in worse conditions, still worried about threats of violence, about actual violence from police, still worried about discrimination, and still trying to get sovereignty to what is supposed to be their own land. So it's like, I don't want to compare it to Israel just because it's like low-hanging fruit in a certain way. And obviously the situation of the ongoing genocide in Palestine is its own beast. But, you know, imagine an Israeli dude living in the West Bank talking about, oh yeah, shit is great over here, you know, or just living in Jerusalem, right? Shit is great over here. Yeah, for you. It's great over there for you. So that's just kind of what is important to touch at, right? Indigenous land defenders, just like in the US, are bravely resisting capitalist extraction projects and then are met with the violence of colonial police forces who simply exist to protect these neoliberal interests. Police protect property. That's what they do. And also, nearly half of the world's mining companies are Canadian. In Latin America, Canadian entities control up to 70% of the mining activities in the region. So, just some quick cursory points. The deflection that will happen here with certain people is that they'll say, oh, you're just hating on Canada. You're just trying to say that no country is good. Well, the United States is still worse. Oh, you're just shitting all over Canada. Making it as if the question in the first place wasn't one of people saying Canada was the superior place. As if there wasn't this problem of Canadian exceptionalism that I'm responding to. So that's what I'm responding to. But if we want to have a realistic and pragmatic conversation about what it's like to live in Canada, what is this southern accent? Then we should have a conversation with a Canadian, right? So I did something fun. I talked to my friend Lily Alexander, who many of you might know. She's an amazing content creator from Canada, from Montreal. And I asked her some questions. And I asked them with a very specific tone of being this kind of American who has pictured in their head that Canada is this safe haven that they can retreat from Trump to. And Lily gave me some great answers. My first question for Lily was this. Hi, Lily. I'm really excited to move to Canada to flee fascism and experience what it's like to live in a real functioning country. I know you guys treat immigrants and ethnic minorities really well, so that shouldn't be a problem, right? Here's what Lily had to say.
How do I put this? Okay. Canada is a very diverse country. It's a country where a lot of people move. However, staying here in the long term can be difficult. It's like, first of all, immigrating here costs a load of money. And second, if you want to stay in the long term, it's like, it's really advantageous to be in a super secure job or in an industry with a lot of demand, that kind of thing.
I want to pause here just to talk about what specifically Lily's talking about. Great sentence. For instance, there's an article from Jessica Roy from this past November, how much it actually costs to move to Canada from the US. This was for the San Fran Chronicle. It's really expensive. It's really expensive. So the first question that you need to answer if you're looking to immigrate, because I know a lot of y'all in the US, you don't know what this is like. You're from the US, you've never had to think about migrating before. Well, the first question you should ask is, does Canada want me? Even Todd in this video, we didn't get into it too much, but he's talking about, skilled workers.
All we're offering is a place where you can keep doing that without all the chaos. We need people here. Skilled workers, healthcare workers.
So you see what I'm talking about. Skilled workers, healthcare workers. So, okay, the point of how expensive it is. If you are one of these people that Canada wants, there's a full list of 370 eligible job categories that you might want to check out. You want to get 3 years of permanent residency for one of those jobs over a 5-year period and then become eligible for citizenship. But how much does it cost, though? So the mandatory legal process costs the medical exam and English or French language test, biometrics, validating your educational background and other fees. Costs $1,807 in US dollars for an individual. Okay, $1,807. That's something I gotta pull out of the emergency fund for, but perhaps I can cop that. You also need a certain amount of money in your bank account to demonstrate you can afford to live there for the first few months, called settlement funds. You get to keep and presumably spend this money, but you have to have it before you can move. That minimum is $10,577 for individuals and $19,000 or so for that family of 4. So this is the money that you need to have to meet the basic legal demands. And then many people who immigrate choose to employ an immigration attorney or consultants to help them with the process, because it's a complicated process. Moving to Canada, the website, the organization, estimates that at $2,800 to $3,600. Folks, are you starting to see what's going on here? Are you starting to see what's going on here, guys? Then there's the cost of international movers. Oh, there's actually furniture I have to bring up to Canada. Oh shit, well that might cost me $720 to $1,800. All in all, the bare minimum cost of a move to Canada, including the settlement funds you need saved up, adds up to roughly $15,000 for individuals, $27,000 for a family of 4. So if you're just scraping by in the US and cost of living is a major concern and healthcare is a major concern, it's going to take a lot of saving for you to get in this position. And that's not even counting cost of rents. Like housing in Canada is a significant problem, big part of social and political discourse in Canada. And then other cost of living issues, which are happening everywhere. They're happening to different varying degrees. Cost of living in Canada is slightly beneath the United States, but it's not pennies on the dollar, let's say. It's a lot of paperwork and it's a lot of costs, but let's say you can brace that.
A lot of people I know come here for university because here in Montreal, we have a lot of universities. And then after graduation can struggle to find a path to sticking around. I've seen friends get deported, you know, mostly just because of like political rot. It's just like turbo racist lately, dude. It's like the anti-immigrant sentiment. I'm sure it was always there in the same way, but it's like it's like been like turbocharged the last 5 years, especially against South Asian immigrants, especially against anybody Arab or Muslim or who seems like they might be. With that said, I think if someone is looking for somewhere to move, you can consider moving here, especially if you're going to come here for school. I think we have things going for us, but oof, oh buddy, if only it were that simple.
So that's the reality of immigration anywhere, right? And that was Lily's answer to my first question. She mentioned the racism, and this is a big elephant in the room. I've seen multiple TikToks on this. This is one.
I'm getting sick and tired of Canadian people. I'm getting sick and tired. Y'all are so focused on complaining about Indians every day. The wage is still low. The rent is still too high. Can we focus on those issues? Every day, immigration. They can bring 1 billion immigrants here. At the end of the day, the wage is still not going up. What's not clicking, Steven? Can we focus on the main task at hand?
It's a really serious issue, especially towards South Asian folks. And it's the same thing we've talked about in the United States, and it's the same thing we talked about in Europe. These cost of living crises, we just mentioned how they're geopolitical. We just mentioned how they're global. These cost of living crises are being seized on by far-right movements who then pin everybody to blame immigrants, particularly the poor working class immigrants, the folks that are not of our culture, as the source of the problem. And it has real material effects on people. I know white folks have a hard time getting their head around the idea that racism isn't just something that they read about in their books, something that they can just condemn on social media, that it actually does affect you if you're not white. But it does, right? You see TikToks like these. I actually was going to play this one first. Just went out and got verbally abused by some white person for being brown. This is literally what living in Canada feels like these days. Other comments. Canadians under every comment section normalizing violent racism towards South Asians. Racism is a form of anger, I need to start jumping them. Johnny Cage. Oh no, from Mortal Kombat? Then go back. Why complain? You guys do worse to Muslims and Sikh. Somebody named Dexter Morgan says it's the same thing when it happens to him because he's white. This is the kind of thing that really, it's heartbreaking, right? This is really affecting people. And even white people are noticing it. Maybe not Todd, but other white people are noticing it in Canada.
It's got to the point now where I can't, if like I see a popular TikTok and there's like a single South Asian person in it, I can't even go to the comments because there's just going to be so many racist Canadians in there saying the stupid same fucking racist jokes, just endless. And I just feel like it's all white people of all ages, right? Like this idea that young people are progressive. No. It feels like white Canadians are seizing this moment because they feel like this is the last little bastion of socially acceptable racism they can do. Like, oh, we're discussing immigration and there's a lot of immigrants from South Asia right now in Canada. This means we can be racist and there'll be no social repercussions. So they're just like leaping on the chance. There's like no reckoning. You know, you could have a high up job. You could post your full name on there, and you could say the most dumb racist shit ever. No one's gonna care because apparently that's like the last bastion of really acceptable racism in this country. And white people have nothing else than a carte blanche to be racist. They are gonna take that chance.
So you get the picture. I don't only have TikToks, by the way. Here's one example of an article chronicling the rise of anti-South Asian hate in Canada from ISD. There has been a marked rise in anti-South Asian hate in Canada over the past several years. Our analysis found that posts containing anti-South Asian slurs increased by more than 1,350%, 1,350% from 2023 to 2024 on X. We also know that there are other conditions that have changed that website and made it so that those things are breeding over there more and more. Police reported hate crimes against South Asian in Canada, increasing more than 227% between 2019 and 2023. Canadian domestic extremists are amplifying anti-South Asian hate at scale on social media. Between March 1st and April 20th in the lead up to the federal election, over 2,300 posts containing anti-South Asian rhetoric were shared across various platforms, which collectively generated over 1.2 million engagements. The white supremacist network Diagolon has been particularly virulent in spreading anti-South Asian hate. I thought that white supremacist networks were only occurring in the US. Said no one ever. Well, said many people apparently. And so this is the environment. Like, we talked about this in the conversation about Europe, right? A lot of people are talking about immigration and giving advice about immigration. And we can tell that you're really just talking about white people. You're talking about where white people can go. If you had to think about race, all of a sudden you would have a lot more conditions, a lot more difficulties in making the clear statement you're trying to make. Someone like Todd can say, Americans come to Canada. Americans come to Canada. And we can implicitly understand that he means white Americans, even though he doesn't say so. And even though probably in his heart of hearts, he doesn't think he's only talking to white Americans. If somebody said, well, I'm Indian American. I'm Desi. Should I go to Canada? He would probably be like, well, I think you should, but it's also important to keep in mind that the current political environment, the current cultural environment, you're full of shit. You're full of shit. You're only talking to white people. You're only talking to white people, aren't you? Why don't you give those conditions then when you're talking about Americans coming to Canada? Because you don't think about Indian Americans in your analysis. You don't think about Muslim Americans in your analysis. You don't think about African folks in your analysis. Black Americans and the Black African diaspora globally. Void Critter, did people already forget about the Freedom Convoy? Because, like, if you know about it, you should know that Canada is racist as fuck to tolerate them for 3 weeks in the capital of Canada. Desi is pronounced Daisy. Sorry, Daisy. There's a weird uptick in comments, says Ume, that claim to be Indian and comment stuff like, this isn't your country, so you shouldn't complain and be grateful. This is, anybody who knows what an immigrant family is like knows that this is a very understandable phenomenon. Immigrant families come to a country, they settle, they develop, they get upwardly mobile. And then the people that they hate the most then are the people who are other immigrants that they think are ruining it for them. Poorer immigrants, undocumented immigrants, illegals, right? Settled immigrants will often be some of the most virulent haters of undocumented immigrants, of poor immigrants. That is a classic reality of migration. It was a reality when it came to the United States, when it comes to a lot of Latinos for Trump here. And the same thing goes in Canada. There's also probably bots involved when it comes to seeing comments like that. But there's absolutely, I've seen multiple testaments to the fact that there's certain brown people in Canada who's like, we should have less brown people in Canada. Guys, you're making it hot. Please leave. Katie Fleece, it is awful. My lib parents are even falling for the right immigrant BS rhetoric. It's very compelling for people. And there's a long history behind that. Israeli bots, oopsie. Oh, Khadija made a video about racism in Canada. I didn't even see it. Shout out to them, by the way. So, okay, that was my first question for Lily. What about my second question? My second question was, I also want to talk about universal healthcare. For those of you interested in moving to the Canadian state, to Canada from the US, you're interested in that universal healthcare. So, it's like way better than the US, right? Let's ask Lily.
I mean, yes, probably. I've never experienced the American system. I hear the stories. We do have a public healthcare system. I don't know that I would call it universal because it doesn't include a lot of things. It has just started rolling out like dental, for example, which is so expensive here. It doesn't in most places include like prescriptions. It doesn't include eyesight. It doesn't in most places include like mental health stuff. But with all that said, like I have benefited a ton from the public healthcare system. It has gotten me loads of stuff for free that I like really, really needed and would not have been able to get otherwise. I think a big part of that is owed to our history of like labor movements and labor parties. Universal healthcare was brought into Canada by a premier of the province of Saskatchewan named Tommy Douglas, who is a sort of a Labour Party member. We can't take it for granted because it is basically in constant peril. It is basically constantly being underfunded by Liberal and Conservative governments because the Labour Party is never like in power on the largest stage. And so like in Ontario, they're privatizing it in a big way. In Quebec, it's just like, it's pretty under-resourced, you know? Like if you need something that's like not as high a priority, you could be waiting 6 months to a year. And by not as high priority, I mean like an MRI, something that could save your life.
Yeah, what Lily's referring to here is a reality that, you know, is, and this is why I was mentioning, you know, that this guy is underplaying it a little bit in his TikTok. It's a reality that in certain cases, you're going to have to wait a long time for really important surgeries, really important procedures, really important care. Median wait times for most cancer surgeries increased by 1 to 5 days between 2019 and 2024. The proportions of patients receiving radiation therapy within 28 days and hip fracture repair within 48 hours were 94% and 83% respectively, a drop of 3 percentage points each when compared with 2019. And this is still not an outright condemnation. We can say, even though like a lot of these wait times cause real problems, this headline speaks for itself. 15,000 plus Canadians died waiting for healthcare in 2023-24, and those are incomplete statistics. So again, this idea that you're gonna be on the waiting list just only if you have like an ingrown toenail, only if you have a minor health condition, it is downplaying the issue. It's downplaying the issue. And somebody like Todd from that TikTok will say, oh, we're not a perfect country. Nobody's saying we're a perfect country. But when you're saying things like that, when you're using rhetoric like, yeah, you'll be on the wait list if you have an ingrown toenail, you're downplaying the issue severely to an extent that makes me think you're not actually interested in expressly addressing those issues, in which case those issues will only get worse. And all the evidence that we have says that's exactly what's happening. We saw Mark Carney, austerity measures. That's what they're going for in Canada, okay? So it's only going to get worse. And that is not even speaking about systemic discrimination that occurs in the healthcare system, which is a fact of healthcare systems globally. It's also accordingly difficult when you are a migrant into a new country to receive the full extent of their social services, including healthcare. So from a perspective of an American who wants to move to Canada, think about that. That's something to consider. Samantha Serrano, that money should go to Israel. Palmberry says that the quality healthcare system is super dependent on the province. And that's actually kind of the case in the US too. There are certain states in which the healthcare system is better due to certain reforms made by the governance of that state. Michigan is an example. Perry says there's a First Nation/Jamaican creator I follow from Alberta, and her Jamaican mother died in hospital from not being taken seriously/medical racism. Same phenomenon that occurs in the US medical system, right? You're thinking you're going to leave the US and get much better healthcare in Canada. And yeah, there might be some material ways that you see that bear out, but you're also going to see a lot of the same issues repeat themselves because these are global geopolitical issues. These are issues that stem from Western imperialist countries and their social systems that expressly benefit a specific group of people most of the time. That's not to say that even if you are a brown person considering going to Canada, that you should say no, absolutely not. But am I not giving you a sense of how to think realistically here? That's what my aim is. So then my next question for Lily Alexander was, Lily Alexander, in the US, our government does like nothing to prepare for or respond to climate disasters, as you saw with the wildfires in LA this winter. How much better is Canada at addressing this stuff? I can't wait to experience good air quality and assurance that climate change won't affect me too much. Okay, well, how does Lily respond to that?
Well, I think where I live in Quebec is kind of a fun case study in this because we have a load of hydro dams. We use overwhelmingly renewable energy. And because of that, our political right is actually pretty progressive on climate and energy stuff just because they don't have skin in the game. There's no big coal mining billionaires. Are there still coal mining billionaires?
There will be. Trump is bringing back coal mining in the US.
But if you look at somewhere like Alberta, where a huge chunk of the economy is oil, huge, it's not so rosy. If you break it down, CO2 emissions per capita, okay, you look at the chart. At the very top is tiny petrostates, like the Gulf states, Brunei, and then right below that is the US, and then right below that is us, and no one else is even close. So I hope that answers your question. We rely so much on fossil fuels for our economy and everything. And we're less ridiculous about, blocking renewable energy. I think we're doing a little better on that front. But no way, dude. If we're so cooked. Maybe a third of the summer I couldn't go outside because of the forest fire smog. And do we respond to it when it happens properly? As far as I know, I haven't heard anything about us messing up the fire response. But when the fires are burning, this is the real number, about 1% of your country every year, even really good firefighters are not going to do everything you need.
Yeah, I love Lily's work too, Just V. So Climate change, climate change, climate change. You would think that a more responsible and more progressive government in Canada, a government that doesn't care about profits and speed, will be much more interested in preserving the environment at the federal level even than a nasty, gross, despicable one like the US is. Well, of course, the numbers bear out that Canada is chugging along, destroying the environment. This is a piece from the CBC just a few days ago. Canada, other fossil fuel producing nations derailing world climate targets, report says, from Jordan Olmsted. While some countries have committed to a clean energy transition, others appear to be turning back to an outdated fossil fuel dependent playbook. Yeah, you can read this article for yourself. Canada not even really interested in reducing oil production. Of the 20 major fossil fuel producer countries profiled in the Production Gap Report, Canada's planned increase to oil production for 2030 compared to 2023 levels ranks only behind Saudi Arabia, Brazil, the United States, and Nigeria. Canada is ranked as a top 4 oil producer with about 6.5% of the global total. And mind you, these wildfires that she was referring to, which we get some wind of, no pun intended, here in the Midwest, in America, are serious issues that also operate on racialized lines. This is a piece from Grist, which you should check out for good coverage of Canadian stuff, by Meow Spotted Elk. Canada's wildfire crisis is displacing First Nations at alarming rates. And this is, again, like every single issue we talk about with regards to Canada. You can zoom in a little bit and see that it disproportionately affects Indigenous folks in Canada. Significant part of the population that is still undergoing systemic prejudice, systemic inequality. Of course, these places where, as Lily says, there is rampant oil production, you see they're also tied often to Indigenous communities that struggle for land sovereignty, struggle to protect these lands, and hence protect the environment. Officials estimate that 76% of wildfires currently burning are concentrated in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, Canada's western provinces, while additional provinces like British Columbia? Parce, pásame la cerveza, oi, 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 British Columbia. Sorry, I'm really stupid. While additional provinces like British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec are also affected. Provincial and First Nation governments, tribal organizations, and the Canadian Red Cross have coordinated emergency efforts in the affected regions. According to officials, on average, 2.1 million acres are lost to wildfires each year, far below the current 9.6 million that have been lost. And so, yeah, this is even blown into Europe. There's parts of Europe that are dealing with these fires as well. We have fires in every region, and you can get into, you can see if you read this article, further coverage of like specific Indigenous-led organizations working to help people with these evacuations, right? Creemergency, a private Indigenous-led emergency response company, was one organization helping Sandy Lake members evacuate. Tyson Wesley, the CEO of that company, adds that empathy is sometimes scarce in many Canadian communities when First Nations evacuees arrive, and many cities can be unwelcoming. There is still a lot of racism in the country. I always say these are people with families and children and grandparents trying to leave their community from a forest fire. It's not that kind of Colombia. Yeah. Would love to see this same type of discussion regarding Ireland or the UK. I actually got into that in a previous video that you can check out. I'll quickly shout out on my second channel. That's where I post VODs from this channel. So everybody who's in the chat wondering if they can catch this later, this will be posted within a couple of days to the Elliot Sang Again channel. I'm going to sneeze. So that includes conversation about the Charlie Kirk assassination and these 2 videos, Americans maybe don't move to Europe and Europeans have a racism problem and don't want to admit it. Get into what you're talking about. I'm here from the second channel. Welcome, Firelord Tony. Shout out to the second channel, the almighty second channel. The YouTube economy changes, but we changed too. Oh, shout out to Turb indeed. Yeah, we're going to get into something Turb sent me by the end of this, by the way. Okay, so my 4th question for Lily Alexander. One thing I hate about the US is how evil we are towards other countries, and how our government always sends our soldiers to war just to retrieve resources, and backs genocide in Palestine. Can you explain to me why Canada is so much more peaceful to the rest of the world? And I thought this question was important because this is the connotation that Canada gets. It's a peaceful country. So what does Lily say?
Well, compared to the US, literally everyone is peaceful, so I think you might be grading us on a curve here. We don't worship guns necessarily, but we take part in a lot of the same wars that the US does. We were super in the war on terror, the war in Afghanistan. We were super in the Korean War. We bombed Yugoslavia with you guys. I think a lot of this stuff slips under the radar because we're not the US, and like the US in terms of numbers is always greater. But yeah, we are right there in step with you in most cases. And when we're not, it's kind of because the US is doing all the war for us. You know, like we benefit from that stuff because we are such a close American trading partner. And this is also part of why Canada is like...
The cat is agreeing. It's signaling its agreement with Lily.
Totally unable to take a moral stance on Palestine. We have close economic ties with Israel, but especially with the US, who like just bully freaking everybody into their stance. Yeah, we are just so on the wrong side of history with that. And I've been totally ashamed. Like even our liberal establishment that's been in power for the past decade is totally shameful on foreign policy stuff.
Yeah, as William says, Canada sure mines a lot. I bet some of the stuff they mine becomes guns, bullets, jets, and bombs. Indeed. And yeah, like Canada is like Japan in that it has no independent foreign policy. That's what Divine has said in the chat. So that includes its unwavering support for Israel, right? This is an article from February 2024 by Eve Engler from Mondoweiss. On the day the International Court of Justice ruled it was plausible Israel was committing genocide and called for it to allow aid into Gaza, Canada suspended its assistance to refugees in the coastal strip, failing to even note that Israel is legally bound by the World Court. Canada acted immediately after Israel officials claimed 12 out of 13,000 Gaza employees at the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees were implicated in Hamas's October 7th attacks. So that same order that Israel made, that the UNRWA should stop being collaborated with, Canada followed that expeditiously. And Justin Trudeau, everybody's favorite white boy, said, "To the members of the Jewish community who spoke with us today, thank you. I want you to know that our commitment to you and to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is unwavering." Just full-on support for a theocracy and somehow democratic state, even though it's clearly an apartheid state. This is the kind of stuff that makes Canada completely... Well, how do I say this? This is the kind of thing that makes it look obviously hypocritical and ridiculous when Canadians try to talk to you about how much more kind their people are, how much more polite and peaceful, and how Canadians don't have a problem with anybody. You have a problem with Palestinians just like the rest of the Western Imperial Front. This is you, and you have problems with people in your own country as well. So thanks, Justin Trudeau, for illustrating that so well. We'll get into a little bit more about that conversation about refugees, but in a similar note, I had a last question for Lily that essentially was about trans folks. Not just trans folks, but also people with disabilities. So this gets at what a lot of the questions are when I talk about these issues. What about for trans folks in the US? What about for folks with disabilities? The way I worded it, because I'm so silly, was, finally, I'm also horrified at the sheer force of capitalism and fundamentalism in the US and how people's rights are stripped away for being different. Can you tell me how it is that Canada is so much better at funding social services and especially protecting trans people and people with disabilities? So what does Lily have to say about that?
I mean, stuff for trans people is not as bad as the US, but low bar, first of all. Second, it is trending worse, I would say. As in the US, health is like sort of left to the provinces in a certain way. And a lot of provinces are instituting more like healthcare bans and general bans on like what trans people can and cannot do. And it's pretty shameful, you know? And then the disability regime is like, I want to mug whoever told you it was good, because it's like a national shame. Like,
before we get into the disability regime, as she mentions, let's talk a little bit about the anti-trans laws that have risen in parts of Canada. So this is a paper by Marina Konina and Travis Salway for CanJ Public Health, the rise of anti-trans laws and the role of public health advocacy. They note that the recent surge in anti-trans laws and policies in Canada and the United States has important public health implications, particularly for trans and gender expansive youth. And just to speak on what exactly they might be talking about, here's a piece from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. CCLA strongly condemns Alberta legislation, this is November 2024, that erodes freedoms of trans and gender diverse youth and their families. So in particular, there was a law that was passed that folks who want to change how their pronouns are referred to in schools and who want to change their chosen name as used in schools have to get express permission from their parents. The kind of like protecting the children legislation that is often used when it comes to discriminating against trans people and then committing genocides against them, frankly. So when we see this starting to rise, we might scoff at it. We might say, oh, well, that's not as bad as the United States. It's not quite as expansive. It's only in certain provinces. Just bear in mind that that's what we were saying in the US a couple of years ago. That's what we were saying. And when we have a Prime Minister of Canada who is so ready to accept the narratives about economic injustice and Canada's place economically from the right wing, and that is trying to parse this coalition between the right wing and some elements of the labor left into this centrist bloc that is so willing to appease the right wing. You know, it's the same thing we talk about with Ezra Klein in the US and the Democratic Party. The Overton window shifts, and you can see that the Overton window in many ways is shifting to the right in Canada. So if you're a trans person, maybe you might want to go to Canada. Somebody mentioned earlier in the chat that someone got all of their gender affirming care approved and paid for by the government, right? That kind of thing is possible. It might not be possible for you, for one, if you're an immigrant to Canada. It might not be possible if you're brown, black, if you're indigenous, but it's on the table regardless, right? And it's something to consider. But much like how in parts of the United States, there are pretty strong legislations against gender and sexuality discrimination, and there are strong progressive communities, and you can even get some resources for whatever gender affirming care you might need or other resources you might need. That's only certain parts of the US, and likewise, that's only going to be the case in certain parts of Canada, especially as time moves. It takes a lot of time to move. Especially as time goes on, you might see that become more and more of an issue. But the problem doesn't just start and stop with anti-trans laws, what's written into law. It's about the execution of that law, police forces that we've talked about earlier, in both cases, in both countries, obviously being focused on pushing a neoliberal agenda and disproportionately harmful towards marginalized people. But it's also about whether or not your community is with you. Right? And so that's something that you have to consider whenever you're moving anywhere. Trucy Law says definitely only for citizens, yeah, but our government does actually take trans healthcare seriously, minus Alberta. Fight tooth and nail to keep the shit Canucks. There's still a chance for Canadians to continue to entrench that, to not fall as far right as the United States is. And I urge people to, in Canada, getting involved with local politics. But it's important for folks in America to know it's not some trans paradise over in Canada. It's not some queer paradise over in Canada. And your mileage may vary with how much of the other stuff you have to deal with, on top of how much discrimination you're still going to have to deal with, as far as whether you're going to make the costly move over. But it's still on the table. I'm not going to tell anybody not to move over there on account of wanting to feel like they have more support. But it's not what people hype it up to be. Certainly not what Todd from the intro hypes it up to be. Now let's talk about disability a little bit. Remember how Lily was calling it a national shame? Not disability. Lily Alexander did not call disability a national shame. She called the way that the Canadian government treats disability a national shame. Please do not get me twisted there.
I want to mug whoever told you it was good, because it's like a national shame. Like they don't give you anywhere near enough money. They keep tabs on you like crazy, and you can't work. The assumption basically is that you're going to have someone like caring for you or supporting you, which, you know, when you're like a 30-year-old with long COVID, not super realistic. We have a MAID here, medical assistance in dying, euthanasia, right? And this was like a thing that I think liberals were pretty open to in the 2010s. And since we've done it here, we've started to see that it's sort of just being used as like a get rid of disabled people free card. Not to be dramatic, but like it's sort of being used for like treatable illnesses that the government just like does not want to spend the money to treat. Maybe this is like a weird, unexpected downside of a public system. I mean, no, the US would also gladly kill disabled people. It just is maybe too Christian to like give them choice in it. I don't know.
So the main conversation is obviously complex, but just speaking with certain people who are taking disability in Canada, there's a very significant difficulty in getting enough to cover rent and being able to fend for yourself. And you can look at accounts of that. So even just beyond the conversation about MAID, it's difficult to get into the country if you're disabled. And when you're disabled in the country, it's difficult to stay there long term. Again, these conversations are focused on people who are skilled workers, who fit the job criterion that somewhat like the Canadian government is looking for, and that have a reasonable ability to meet the demands of the move. It's not going to be the working class and poor disabled people who are facing the brunt of the oppression occurring in the US. This conversation is so segregated. I have to rant about this for a second again, because we really have to start treating the moving conversation for what it is. It's a segregated conversation. It is a conversation fully being had only by people who make a certain amount of money or consider themselves to be in a certain class position. And it's not one that takes into account, somebody had said this in the chat earlier, that the people who really are going to be facing the problems in the United States and have been facing the problems in the United States lack the resources and are in the categories that make it so that a move to Canada is not a reasonable expectation a lot of the time. It's the people who need to move that aren't going to be able to move. And the people who can move are generally going to be the people who are not affected here, who are not affected in the United States nearly as much. And so a lot of the times they're treating it like it's a tax write-off. They're treating it like it's an economic opportunity. They're treating it like it's a mere change of cost of living, and really like a mere change of vibes. They're seeing all the news about what Trump is doing to marginalized people, scary incidents of Trump and ICE abducting people, stuff that really affects black and brown people, stuff that really affects poor people in this country, indigenous folks. And the vibes of that creep them out, make them sad, and make them want to move so that they don't have to focus on that anymore. It's the same way a lot of people, when it came to the presidential election, didn't really want to combat the issues of the Trump administration. They just didn't want to deal with the aesthetics of it. They didn't want to deal with the austerity. They didn't want to deal with Palestine. They didn't want to deal with even the Epstein files as far as it concerned the Democratic Party. A lot of people were very willing to just do Biden/Kamala Harris business as usual, which was abducting people with ICE. ICE was very much extant during the Biden administration. The current director of ICE was somebody given a presidential award by Barack Obama years ago. The current administration is merely making it hard for people to defend America, hard for people to feel like America is comfortable, hard for people to feel like America is this beautiful, peaceful place. And so instead of wanting to change the issues, they want to move somewhere where they can feel like they're in a bubble again, where they can feel like their country represents them. And hell, if you're a white person with money, hell yeah, Canada's going to represent you as it's going to represent in any other country. But the reality is that you are a protected class, and merely abdicating your responsibility to take care of marginalized communities by saying, I'm going to flee, it's an insult to refugees that actually have to flee from atrocities. I'm going to flee to Canada. No, you're not. You're moving for an economic opportunity. You're moving because you like the culture. You're moving because you think it seems nice over there. And why don't you just say that as it is? And that's what's so disingenuous too about a TikTok like that of Todd's at the beginning. We keep railing on Todd, right? That's what's so disingenuous, is because it's situated as, don't you want to protect your kids? What are you talking about? The people who are disproportionately affected by gun violence in the United States are poor. The people who are disproportionately affected by the chaos of the United States have been affected by that chaos for a long time, and you've only started to care now that it has affected your bottom line, now that it might be weakening the US dollar. But newsflash, if it's going to collapse the US dollar, first of all, that's not going to bode well for your economic prospects moving to another country. But second of all, the fact is, this fascism is a global phenomenon. It's tied with global phenomena. It is not something that you can just pin to the US as this crazy, chaotic country with zany leaders. It is a reality of the economic system that has pushed further and further this type of right-wing libertarianism as a response to the anti-communism and the McCarthyism of the 50s and 60s that made America as habitable for marginalized populations as possible. And through vibes, through neoliberalism, through aesthetics, has convinced you for so long that it is this safe place. Well, safe for who? Safe for who? What's not clicking, Todd and Steve? We're talking about global Euro-colonial capitalism. That's a great term, Natalia. And trust me, it's not just European countries engaged in it. You have client states in the Arabic world that are sitting and watching and applauding as people in Gaza get genocided, as people in Sudan get genocided. It is people in India. It is a ruling party in India that is very much trying to dominate regional politics through its own brand of fascism. But the reality is, you're not just going to escape it. If you're thinking about migrating, you have to think about it as a situation that is personal. You have to think about it as a situation that is specific to your desires and your needs. Am I going to be able to study there? Is it good for somebody with my job? Is this city something that I'd like to deal with, somewhere that I'd like to be, etc.? When we're talking about fleeing, we're talking about refugees, we're talking about asylum, we're talking about situations that have very much never been in favor of the marginalized people that you invoke as you try to justify your capital flight. Okay? This is capital flight that you're trying to justify. And to illustrate my point, right? This is from 3 months ago on Ask Transgender. Can I apply for asylum in Canada as a trans/pan woman? You cannot. Asylum is the hardest route to go. To apply for asylum in a different country, you have to meet a very, very high standard. As this person puts, you have to prove that there are no actions that you can take to be safe in your home country, right? When you are at the point where you can successfully apply for and receive asylum from a different country, you will be literally at the doorstep of dying. That is what asylum is for. That is what refugees are. They're people who are escaping near death, or at the very least, significant impairment, all the time. And on those terms, they're allowed to take residence in different countries, after which, of course, the people of those countries start complaining that their country is being taken up by dirty, poor migrants and want to take their country back. But the reality is, the standard is just not being met right now. And that's on Canada and the United States, as far as whether a trans person can say, I have to flee to Canada because it's dangerous for me here. They don't think that standard is being met. And you can take that for what it is. You can agree with them. You can disagree with them. I think in many cases you'd have a right to disagree. You'd have a right to say, I absolutely should try to flee my country because I absolutely have cause to think that these people are trying to exterminate me on behalf of my sexuality or my gender. I personally think a lot of people can say that. But I also think a lot of people just don't realize that the problem is a global imperial problem. And that you're not just going to be able to flee to Canada because it has better attributes on a score sheet. Just to drive this home more, I found this important TikTok from a trans man in Canada. Please watch this.
Trans man who was living in Texas for the entirety of this fool's first administration and is now currently in Canada. I have seen almost exclusively misinformation, specifically relating to seeking asylum in Canada, that I believe is putting my community at risk. So I really need this video to get out there. Clearly, I've been sick. I was hoping that I could wait until I had more of my voice back to make this video, but I don't think I can because, as I said, I've seen almost exclusively misinformation, incorrect information about seeking asylum in Canada. So if you've never seen me before, my name is Matt. I met my wife on this app. We got married 3 years ago, and we moved me up to Canada in 2023. We recently spoke to an immigration lawyer just to verify this information, so I promise you I know what I'm talking about. To be clear, I know that we all acknowledge that things are not safe right now for trans people, especially socially speaking, right? But as a country, Canada still considers the United States to be a safe country, which means that if you try right now to apply for asylum based on what is happening right now, things that in some cases haven't even been signed into law, things that are currently being challenged in court, you will not be approved. And the reason that is such an issue is that if your application is denied, you will not be allowed to apply again or enter the country. Meaning that if things change and Canada does say, oh, we're going to open up a new path for trans people or whatever, you will not be able to do that. The person we spoke to told us that out of 600 applications, only 2 were accepted. And the reason so many of those applications have been denied is that you have to be able to prove that you as an individual, if you are not allowed to enter the country, your life is in immediate danger. And that is a really big burden of proof to have to meet that most people can't. You cannot say the community to which I belong. It literally needs to be you. Now, keep in mind, there are a lot of people who are reaching out to government officials here, trying to explain that situation to them to get them to make the appropriate changes, okay? But until that happens, the people that are telling you, yeah, go ahead and apply because you'll definitely be accepted, they are wrong. I am seeing people choosing to take their own lives. I have friends who are losing friends because they are terrified. And the last thing that we need is for people to be thinking that this is it, this is definitely going to work for them, and then they get denied, and then they're just fucked. I'm going to say it again. Out of 600 applications, only 2 were approved. It is currently Saturday, February 8th, okay?
So this is from Saturday, February 8th, as he just said. The point of this is the way that you are going to get to move to Canada on most counts is by migrating. A visa, temporary resident status of all different kinds, migrating to a different country. And that's the same process it's always been, which has always been a costly process, a significant process of personal undertaking, of personal evaluation of one's own circumstances and how they will be in another country. It is a risk, it is difficult, and when you get there, will the conditions realistically be very different for you? You have to think about it like that. Thinking about it like on terms of you're fleeing, I'm a refugee, I'm in deep fear for my own life and my own safety. Folks from Gaza are getting turned down. Somebody just pointed this out. Folks from Sudan are getting turned down from entering countries on that behalf. It's very difficult for folks to just be able to go somewhere. And then that makes it sound like it's this magical, easy process from there if you can prove that. It's not. So I just need people to have a realistic understanding of migration here. That is why I have done this little series, not only to just talk about how Canadians are racist, how Canadians are drifting further right, just like in Europe, how Europeans are racist, how European politics are drifting further right, not just to talk about how global crises affect cost of living everywhere, not just to talk about how rampant anti-migration sentiment is becoming everywhere, but to talk about the fact that migration is still migration. It didn't magically change because you're American. It didn't magically change because Trump happened. Migration is still migration. And if you know what migration is like, you know that it's not a simple game of which country is better than another. And yeah, let's prove this point a little bit further because I actually have something really important to say on this note. We can talk a little bit about Made Another Day, assisted dying, okay, which now accounts for 1 in 20 Canada deaths. It is a very controversial issue, one that deserves a lot of attention and a lot of deep consideration. But it is an issue that is disproportionately affecting disabled people. And I think it would be irresponsible for someone to talk about it and not mention that there is some level of austerity that is at play here, meaning that there is some degree to which these deaths are being turned to by the state as a reasonable answer to not taking care of certain people with disabilities, even though they can, even though it's possible. This is not a conversation about one's own autonomy, to be frank. It's a conversation about why governments give you the choices that they give you. But that's a conversation for another day. Turb, friend of the program, shared this opinion piece a couple of months ago and shared it with me recently, which says Canada must redress its discriminatory and dangerous immigration policy for Sudan, and shared this excerpt in particular. The article's paywalled, so I gotta show the excerpt. While the Sudan situation drastically deteriorated, Canadian Sudanese families paid the government millions of dollars in application fees without expedited arrivals to show for it. These funds could have otherwise been sent directly to families in Sudan. As of this February, almost a year into the program, only 4% of applicants have arrived in Canada, or just 291 people. Refugees from Sudan. And there's word from Turb and from others in the community over there that the funds that Sudanese people gave to the government ended up being diverted over to Ukrainian refugees. That's the word on the street, which I cannot report as fact. I can't find the official verification of such a story. But in terms of what the actuality is, it's very clear that a NATO country, or a country that is being targeted for entrance into NATO by NATO countries, in Ukraine, a European country with white people, takes priority, even in terms of its war refugees, over those of people who are facing genocide and atrocities in the Congo, in Sudan, in Palestine. Palestine in specific is a great example of this. This is from July. Canadian government accused of holding back on Palestinian immigrants. 5,000 approved by Ottawa, but only 620 have made it to Canada. The Canadian government has been accused of deliberately stalling on visas after only 620 of 5,000 Palestinians deemed eligible to come to Canada have arrived. Al Jazeera reported that there is, and this was a couple months prior, lawsuits at play. Palestinian families are suing Canada over visa delays they say leave people at risk of life-threatening harms in Gaza. Palestinian families are suing the Canadian government over delays in the issuance of visas meant to allow them to escape Israel's deadly war in Gaza and receive temporary protection in Canada. That prior article is from AA by Barry Ellsworth. This article is from Al Jazeera by Gillian Kessler DeMoore. The visa program has apparently been plagued by inefficiencies. The prolonged delay has left Gaza-based relatives open to life-threatening and inhumane conditions in the Palestinian territory. There's no rhyme or reason to how the codes are being rolled out, and the fact that there's no transparency here it's emotional torture, frankly. Canada launched the special Gaza visa program on January 9, 2024, a few months into Israel's attacks on the coastal Palestinian enclave. Great timely response, huh? The scheme allowed Canadian citizens and permanent residents to apply to bring extended family members from Gaza into the country amid the war. If approved, successful applicants would receive temporary residency for up to 3 years. But from the start, families and immigration lawyers said the process was confusing and included invasive questions that went beyond what is typically required, including inquiries about any scars or injuries that required medical attention. You see what the kind of things they prioritize are? What kind of care will we have to do for you, right? Just to give you, again, a sense of what it's like for disabled folks moving to other countries. One of the people, according to my own conversations with him, that is trying to get this entrance into Canada and has filled out this paperwork is Ahmed Mater, a person who I've worked with and featured before. He's also been featured on Shanspeare's channel. Ahmed has family in Canada and has filled out all the paperwork, including, body stuff for Canada. I've seen paperwork behind the scenes. Of course, I'm not at liberty to show it to you. And despite that, you see his images, you see his videos from Gaza, right?
بتولي على النار لتسخين بعض الطعام لعائلتي. الكاد لا أستطيع النوم أنا وعائلتي من شدة القصف.
Despite that, he has not been allowed to enter. This is a process that has taken over a year. He's still waiting. This is him and his shirt blood-stained with the blood of a family member who had died in front of him, died in his arms. This is from a few days ago, a week ago. Okay? So at the end of this presentation here, I just want to bring people to look at Ahmed and his page. I want to bring some attention there. He's raised funding. Please continue to donate to his campaign. I will leave the link in the description. I just wanted to bring some attention to his story because I've been talking about him with it. Additionally, you can also make donations in general to the UNRWA and other, verified organizations. I would ask questions with regards to certain people certain organizations, right? But this is the kind of reality that refugees are facing. In the case of the Palestinian genocide, or in the case of the genocide in Sudan, of the case of atrocities taking place around the world, this is what it's like to seek asylum. This is what it's like to find temporary residency status and seeking a very obviously dangerous situation. And so what I need Americans to understand, again, is the people who need to move or can justify saying that they need to move, who would really benefit from having the services another country could provide for them on a federal level potentially, they're not going to be able to because those governments are very selective. Like in certain cases they will be able to, they will try their best in many cases, but in a lot of cases they won't be able to because of the process of entering these countries, because of the processes of attaining residency status in these countries, which systemically discriminates, to be frank, against those who do not fit certain politically expedient categories or certain economically expedient categories. Moreover, put simply, if you're white and you're in the US and you make a working class or middle class salary and you have at least a couple of family members and a couple of friends who make working class and middle class salaries, regardless of your gender identity, regardless of your sexuality, you are more privileged than a great chunk of the world. That does not mean you shouldn't consider moving, but understand that this is a process, like any other process, that systemically privileges you. And likewise, in the country you live in currently, many of the processes still systemically benefit you. And even with that in mind, the reality is that it will be utterly difficult to make a move work to such a degree that you can say it was worth it. Moving because of political purposes, political reasons, it's not an irrational thing to do. It's not unreasonable. But the conversation on it is so often the case as irrational. It's so often a segregated conversation that privileges the voices of white folks in America who are unhappy with the vibes and starting to feel fear about their place in society for the first time in their lives in certain cases. Obviously not in many of the cases, but in many of the cases, these are the voices that are the most privileged in these conversations. And it's not a conversation about realistically, what is migrating going to be like for you? And so please give the conversation about moving the due respect it deserves. The respect of understanding it not to just be a matter of choosing countries on a piece of paper based off of what their federal government says it does. A conversation about fleeing fascism by going to Poland because the crime is so much lower and I can walk on the streets at night. That is not reality. That is not realistic. Moving is a matter of personal experience, even down to seeking asylum. Moving is a matter of your personal situation. And if your personal situation says, this looks like a good idea to move over here, then do it. But for many of you, as fearful as you might be or as uncomfortable as you might be, the sad reality is that that's not going to be your situation. There is no safe haven for you to flee to. The only way you can have that safe haven is by building it and constantly struggling for it, fighting to maintain it and to build it. That is so much not a reality in Poland. Exactly, the drill. Katie Fleece says, thank you for being a sane voice online. I'm selfishly thankful about your COVID consciousness. It makes me feel a lot less alone to have folks like you and Taylor Lorenz speaking to it. Thank you. Yes, Poland had a huge abortion rights backslide recently. I get what you're saying, says S. Mastro, but I don't like considering the recognition of basic human rights as a privilege, but yeah, there is nuance there. I would say it doesn't extend to the basic human rights recognition. What I'm speaking about is you have the ability to afford living life in a walkable city in the United States. Maybe it's an apartment that you have to share with a couple of roommates. You have family that have property in the United States. You have certain systemic privileges. That's more than just recognition of basic human rights. That's the reality, the tangible reality of you having a lot of resources compared to most of the world. And so don't throw that away. Make your decisions carefully and cautiously. And understand that even if my advice to you was you should just leave the US, you should just flee, it wouldn't change the fact that a lot of you aren't going to be able to make it work for various reasons. And so please gather all the information necessary. Understand how racism is working, how anti-migration sentiment is working, how far-right slides are working. Understand how social services are being cut everywhere. Understand how those social services themselves disproportionately affect certain groups. Understand that. And make your decision based off of, will this situation work for me? Do I want to study at this university? Or do I think studying at this university is a good idea? Do I think I can hack it staying a couple of years here? Do I have enough money to do so? But it's really, really dangerous to sit here and be like, Americans, just leave America. Because then you're blaming people for facing reality by suggesting that they can just avoid it. That's my overall point. I meant specifically the walking safely on the street. Like, that should be a basic human right. It is. And the fact is, people are able to walk safely on the street everywhere because that's a very subjective reality. What I'm referring to specifically was in my video about Europe and migrating to Europe. It started with a TikTok of an American saying she moved herself and her family back to Poland. And this is why America's getting bad. And look at all these great things in Poland. And she specifically named, I as a woman can walk alone on the street at night and not worry about being attacked because Poland is one of the safest countries in the world. And we all kind of just scoffed at that because that's not the reality. Being a woman walking alone in the street at night doesn't suddenly get better because you're in Europe. Even if you're a white woman, like, assaults still happen. The idea that you should just walk around with your hands in the air without a care because you're in a safe country now is exactly how people get mugged. It's exactly how people get attacked. They let their guard down because I'm not in one of those dirty places, okay? And that's not to victim blame them. Although, you know, if you're an American and you get pickpocketed in Europe because you think it's way safer and nobody will do anything to you, I will kind of blame you for that. But it's just that you're setting these really unrealistic standards that don't understand how crime fundamentally works, how cities fundamentally work, how safety fundamentally works, which is, it is often a matter of luck, it's a matter of perception, it's a matter of subjectivity. And lots of women will be able to tell you that, no, I'm not able to walk alone safely in Poland. So that's what I'm referring to, right? There is no safe haven. And I think even though a lot of people will tell you, oh, no, I don't think Canada is perfect, I don't think this part of Europe is perfect, but it's better than the US, even just saying that, you indicate that you are actually thinking about it as a safe haven, because instead of measuring how the situation has personally worked for you and why that works, you're measuring it as, oh, this is a universal experience because this country is better. And the reality is, like, a lot of folks are safer in their home countries than they are when they move to the United States or when they move to Europe. Like if you're a Mexican person who owns property in Mexico and you move to Spain, you probably are going to experience a lot more racism for sure, and often more crime, more discrimination. So when you talk about the movement of people, you have to put it through the lens of their own experience, their own subjectivity, and their own specific needs that they look for somewhere else. Because even in cases where folks can go from a safer country to a less safe country and vice versa, it often doesn't bear out that way because it's not this neat, even game of better country, worse country. And especially when it comes to global crises, there's no avoiding that. There's no avoiding that. So that's the end of my presentation. This was a long one, but I had a lot to say and I had a good time. I hope you're all doing well. Please join my Patreon. Link is in the description. Donate to Ahmed's Chuft. Donate to the UNRWA. Links will be in the description. Thank you for having this conversation with me. This was great. Will I grow back the stash? One day. You'll see. But keep being you, and you have the tools at your disposal to make your situation better. People are doing it all the time. There's a lot of hope out there, even as things get so bad. So that's all I have to say.
ايش نقول لهم عشان نطلع على كندا؟
مين قال لك؟
عطنا شوفونا
انت يلا
لقيتها يا عمي أنية